Well, good evening. As many of you probably remember me from my time here at the cathedral, I'm Father Matthew Staling. I'm a priest in Mount Pleasant right now. I've been assigned to St. Michael's in Mount Pleasant. And a couple months ago, Father Braun asked me to join him in his three-part series on the liturgy, on beauty in the liturgy. So far this summer, you've talked about sacred vestments, you've heard about sacred architecture, and now you get to listen to some music. So we'll be talking tonight about beauty in the liturgy, particularly regarding sacred music. So what is sacred music? I'm sure as Father Braun and Father Boland both probably mentioned, that when we talk about something being sacred, what we mean is that it's set apart. It's something that's been set apart for a particular use, reserved for a holy purpose. Now, when Father Braun talked about sacred vestments, he's talking about things that you're using only in the liturgy. He doesn't walk down the street or go shopping in Brookshire's in his chasuble and stole. And in the same way, priests also don't wear their flip-flops and shorts and a tank top as they're coming down the aisle for Sunday Mass. So when we're talking about sacred music, we're talking about something very specific. We're talking about music that is intended for the liturgy, that is set aside specifically for liturgical use. So this is the music that we sing in Mass. Also music that we may sing for the Liturgy of the Hours, or for a procession, or some of the other sacraments. Now, there's a difference, though, between this music, which we use in worship, in the liturgy proper, with what we'll call religious music. Now, they're similar in their themes and in their texts, but they're not the same. Religious music is not set aside in that same way as sacred music would be for the liturgy. So when we're speaking about religious music, we would say all sacred music is religious, but not necessarily all religious music is sacred. Just to give you an example, there's a very good piece of music by a modern composer named Eric Whitacre. It's a 15-minute piece, and the text is about Absalom. When David heard that Absalom was slain, he went up into the chamber over the gate and said, my God, my son, would God that you had died, that I had died for thee. So it's straight out of the Bible. It's straight out of the Old Testament. But it's not a piece that we would necessarily use anywhere in the liturgy. It has no place in the liturgy. There is a third type of music that I'll refer to as well, which is secular music. That which is not set aside for liturgical purpose. This is music that's not based on religious texts or themes, and it can be wide-ranging in its styles. So we're talking about everything from, folk music, rock and roll, classical symphonies, jazz, what we would dance to, what we listen to most of the time on our radios. There are some exceptions with that, but for the most part, it's what we would use just in our non-liturgical lives. Now, secular music differs not just in the themes and text, but also, I think, in instrumentation. There are older documents, Trale Sollicitudini, which was written about 1901 by actually one of the bigger reformers of the liturgy, Pius X, who actually bans piano in the liturgy. He bans the use of piano. Now it was considered at that time kind of a bar instrument. You'd only find a piano typically in, a saloon or something like that. And so he didn't feel that it was appropriate for the sacred liturgy. You can get into arguments about, well, what does that mean? What is appropriate? What is not? And a lot of it comes down to taste, but I think there are some limitations. We I don't think, would use a didgeridoo, that Australian instrument, for our Roman worship. It's not something that's ever had any place in the tradition and just doesn't fit the nature of the liturgy as we have it. Now, I think there's been a blurring, a lot of blurring of the lines between the religious, secular, and the sacred music, particularly over the last 50 years. In some cases, I believe this blurring leads to a laxity about what we do when we come to the liturgy. I think it can set up sort of a nonchalance about the purpose of why we're here, about the profound mystery that we are experiencing in the sacred liturgy. How many of us, when we think about coming to the sacred Mass, do we hear the same music that we were just listening to on our radio? Should we hear the same music that we were just listening to on our radio? A lot of that depends what station you're listening to, obviously. But I did want to share, and I'm not the only one that thinks this. This is not just, my personal opinion. In Sacramentum Caritatis, the post-synodal exhortation by Benedict XVI, one of the documents, by the way, which Bishop Strickland has asked all of the priests of the diocese to read in order to renew the liturgy across the diocese, Benedict writes, certainly as far as liturgy is concerned, we cannot say that one song is as good as another. Generic improvisation or the introduction of musical genres which fail to respect the meaning of the liturgy should be avoided. Now, let the fighting begin as to, what we think should be, what is proper. Before we move on any further, I want to talk a little bit about music in general. Take a step back from the sacred music and turn to just some interesting research that I came across in preparing this talk. When we look at the brain, and scientific inquiry over the last decades has really given us a good insight into this. I think it's common knowledge that different parts of the brain control different functions. They control different bodily functions. They control our motor, our language, whatever. For example, there's a part of the brain called the Wernicke's area, which is right behind your left ear. And people that experience damage on that part of their brain have trouble with their speech. So we know that that's one of the language centers. At the top of your head is, kind of up here, is sort of the motor cortex, where our motions and our movements are controlled. There's the hippocampal complex near the center of your brain, which deals with memory. So all of these different areas kind of have a different function. When they've done studies on the effects of music on your brain, what they find is that music affects not a single area, but almost the entire brain simultaneously. Your higher level thinking, but also some of your more basic instincts. It affects your auditory, the auditory parts of your brain, your language parts of the brain. So when we listen to music and we have the wires stuck to our head, the whole thing is lighting up. And also the very primitive emotional part that controls the emotional part of our brain as well. So when we have a conversation about music, I think this is why we get so worked up. This is why I find some of the biggest fights and some of the biggest yelling matches you'll ever find within the church often surround music. Sit in on a liturgy committee meeting and you'll understand what I mean. So it's something that's very basic to us and very it's a very basic part of our anatomy, of the way we're created. We are musical creatures from our very biology. If you want to know some more about this, This Is Your Brain on Music, The Science of a Human Obsession by Daniel Levitin is where most of this information has come from. Very, very fascinating from a purely secular side, from a purely secular angle, however. So music, as I said, music is a basic, almost biological function for us. And it's certainly a quintessential element of every culture. Every single culture, without exception, has some tradition of music. And particularly, they have some tradition of religious music. Music that was used for their religious ceremonies. Now, our religious tradition, our religious music tradition, arrives first from the Jewish religious tradition. As we look at the Mass itself, at some of the older texts, we can see a clear connection, particularly in the use of psalms, and even in the retaining of certain psalms in particular places between the way the Jews worshipped in the early centuries to what we worship today. For example, if you're familiar with the Liturgy of the Hours, praying of the Breviary, Psalm 95, "Come, let us sing to the Lord," is an introductory psalm that starts out every day. It's how you open the day with prayer. This was also an introductory psalm that was used in the Jewish Sabbath services. It was the first thing that they would sing as they started their Sabbath celebrations. We also see a Jewish connection with just some of our language. The words Amen and Alleluia have a Hebrew root. They don't come from the Greek, they don't come from a Latin, but were imported from Hebrew. The repetition of the Holy, 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 the Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus during the Mass, is also derived from the Jewish Kedusha, the Kadosh, 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 that they would have used in their own praise and singing. But there's also some similarities when we look at the melodies that are used. There's a striking parallel between one of the tones that was used for lamentations during the Easter Triduum, during the morning recitation of the Easter Triduum matins, and a Jewish tone of the same text. We've got the two examples. The top line is the Christian chanting of the lamentations, while the bottom is the Jewish chanting. I'll try to sing this so you can get an idea. You can see it patterns very similarly, just on a visual in a visual way. But let's see. Da 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 is the first line. Da 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 da. So we can see there's a very close correlation between two pieces of music that were separated by, hundreds and hundreds of miles and 1,200 years of musical of time as well. There are other examples. This is just one of the clearer examples. As we talk about sacred music, music for the liturgy, we have to understand a little bit about the liturgy itself and the development of the liturgy over the course of time. The singing of the Psalms we get from the Jewish tradition and have always been a very fundamental part of our liturgy. And it's in these first couple of hundred years that we see the liturgy as we know it start to take shape. Now, Psalms weren't the only things that were sung. We do see the use of hymns in the early church. And we even have examples of this from Scripture. Paul says to the Ephesians, chapter 5:19, address one another in psalms and hymns and inspired songs. And again in Colossians, he writes, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, as you teach and admonish one another in all wisdom, and as you sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. So there is a tradition of hymns within the Christian, the early Christian church. They are, however, suppressed in about the second, third century. There were at that time Gnostic versions of some of the Psalms, Gnostic hymns that were gaining popularity. Now, if we remember from our church history, Gnosticism was a heresy which crops up every now and again, but it revolves around and focuses on a secret type of knowledge that only the truly initiated can fully understand and understand the revelation of God in the Scriptures. Eventually, the Council of Laodicea in 360 banned the use of hymns. They were gaining popularity, and they had questionable theology or outright heresy. And so the church said, no more. The Mass itself is also developing. Even if we look to the preconciliar Mass, the extraordinary form of the Mass, the Mass of the early centuries doesn't quite look like that. There's still a lot of development that has to take place. But there are some certain elements that are there from the very beginning, from very, very early on. For instance, the Roman canon, which we call Eucharistic Prayer number 1, the first Eucharistic prayer, was being used from very, very early on. In about the year 120, the Holy, Holy, Holy is added as a regular part of the Mass. Pope Damasus in 366 organizes the liturgy, the liturgy in Rome, after a model of the church that exists in Jerusalem. And so he adds to the liturgy the Alleluia. So up until that point, the Alleluia might have been used in some Masses in some places. And this continues. In 440, Pope Leo I institutes a cycle of chants for the whole year. So we start to see more organization for the entire year. In 510, Pope Symmachus extends the use of the Gloria to all Sundays and feasts and the feasts of martyrs. So until that time, it was only used in particularly high feasts, maybe Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, things like that. In 600, Gregory I expands the use of the Alleluia to all Masses throughout the year, except during Lent. And he also adds the Christ have mercy part of the penitential rite. He adds the Christi eleison. The point that I want to get at all of this is that the Mass is developing. The Mass is being gathered and systematized and regularized as time goes on. What we also begin to see by the 5th century, so about the 400s, is in different places in the Mediterranean, various melodies surrounding the liturgy start to crop up. So we have particular styles, the Benevettan, Ambrosian, Old Roman, and Mozarabic, and Gallican styles of chant. I've got some examples of these just so you can get a sense of what Mass would have sounded like in some of the early centuries. This is an example of an Ambrosian chant. So that was an example of Ambrosian chant, which was in Milan, in and around Milan. This is Mozarabic chant, which was found on the Iberian Peninsula in Spain. And then this is an example of what we think Roman chant sounded like, old Roman chant, in and around Rome. Very different. It sounds very, what we would consider very Eastern to our ears. But there's one striking difference between what you would hear, say, in like an Eastern Orthodox church or in the Middle East, was the language that was used. All of that was in Latin. So even though there are these varying styles, Latin is still the universal language of the church at this time. Now, as you can see, we've got Benevettans in southern Italy, Ambrosian near Milan, Mozarabic in Spain, Old Roman, which is around Rome, Gallican, which is in what's now France and Gaul. Where does Gregorian chant come into all of this? I haven't mentioned that yet. Well, at this time, in the 5th, 6th centuries, Gregorian chant as we know it didn't exist yet. So where did we get Gregorian chant from? Gregorian chant develops in the later half of the 8th century, and it really is sort of a combination of politics and music that bring about the rise of Gregorian chant. So in the later half of the 8th century, the Papal States A vast territory, most of Italy, was controlled by Stephen II, Pope Stephen II. Now, he had some enemies in northern Italy, the Lombards. They were just south of the Alps there, just in the very, very top of Italy. The king of France at the time, the king of the Franks, was a man by the name of Pepin the Short. I don't think he was very tall. He had sort of taken control of most of the territory in France, and in order to cement his authority, he needed some help. He wanted the approval of the Pope. And so what he does is he says, "Your Holiness, I'll help you with the Lombards. Why don't you come visit me for a while?" So the Pope, at the end of the century, goes to France and spends quite a long time there. Now, when a Pope travels, hundreds of miles to visit somebody, he doesn't go by himself. He brings with him his entire court, his entire entourage of musicians, of other priests, some cardinals. It's a big group, and they're planning to stay for a while. So he stays at Saint-Denis near Paris, and brought with him not only people, but the way in which they worshipped in Rome. He brought the Roman liturgy. Pepin saw this as an opportunity to unify his own domain, but also to form stronger ties with the Holy Father. And so he begins to adopt Roman liturgical practices, not just music, but also the way in which Mass is said. Now, no books existed for chanting at this time. There was no system of writing down chant at this point. And so everything had to be done by ear, by word of mouth in essence. So cantors and scholas were sent from Rome into France, and what occurs is a cross-fertilization between the music of Rome and the music in Gaul, the music in France. And this is where Gregorian chant is born. If you do a very close analysis, it sounds very different, but if you were to do a close analysis of the Roman chant that I played and compare that with the same Gregorian text, you would see similarities in the movement, similarities in certain pitches, similarities in what we call the reciting notes, the notes that you kind of you say multiple words on the same note. You would see similarities in that. Now, Gregorian chant doesn't take off. It doesn't take off. All of these other places still have their older traditions. But eventually the resistance is broken through technology, through a method of writing, method of writing the chants. And so we see this is the part of the St. Gallen manuscript, which is how they would transmit chanting, melodies using these little squiggles and dots and things. They all mean something. I recently took a class to try to interpret some of these things. A lot of it is guesswork. But if you knew sort of the melody, these were cues to remind you of how it went. And so because of this system of writing chants, Gregorian chant takes on a stronger role, a more important role. And eventually, it replaces the old Roman chant. It replaces, for the most part, the Mozarabic chant. The Ambrosian chant still has a tradition even today because that liturgy, the Ambrosian liturgy, still exists in Milan. So by the 10th and the 11th century, so 900s, 1000s, most of the repertoire is pretty much established. The Mass has developed to a pretty stable place at this time. The canon of the texts is set. The texts that are used at each particular liturgy are written down, there's copies of them, and it's spread throughout the Christian world, more or less. So what we begin to see during these Middle Ages is really a blossoming of interpretation and creativity that's taking place. We see the beginning of polyphonic music really being used in the liturgy. Now this begins with what we call organum, which is very similar to chant, but there was usually a single note or a couple of notes that were kind of droning underneath the rest of it. One of the great composers was a man by the name of Leonin, and this is an example of some of the music that he wrote for the liturgy. We hear something that sounds much closer to Gregorian chant and is based, most likely this piece is based on the Gregorian melody with that drone note kind of going on underneath it. We also see a development in other styles, other types of Gregorian music. Some of you may be familiar with Hildegard von Bingen, a mystic of the Middle Ages who also composed some beautiful music in a Gregorian style. These would have been hymns that might have been incorporated into parts of the liturgy, used as meditation pieces, also used during other sacraments, maybe during adoration, or just at different points in the liturgical life. Okay, on your marks, get set, let's go. We're going to do a very fast forward through the development of sacred music for the next 1,000 years. Because really the development of sacred music is the history of music. So much, especially in these early days, it was done for the sake of the liturgy. So we'll just kind of fire through some examples here. We see kind of in the late Middle Ages into the Renaissance period developing, even more developing of polyphonic music, which means more than one voice. So this is an earlier piece by William Dufay, a composer. Now that's a Kyrie, so that's part of what we call the ordinary of the Mass. They would have used that along with the Gregorian chant for what we call the propers, and I'll talk more about those in a little bit. Here's another one, really the height of polyphonic sacred mass music, in my opinion, is Palestrina. This is from his Missa Brevis, is also a Kyrie. We can see some similarities between that and the piece before, but the second piece, the Palestrina piece, is a little bit more complex, a little bit more lyrical in its style. We also see more instruments being used at this time. Another great example, an English example, is William Byrd, who has some of the most beautiful masses I've ever heard. William Byrd lived in England during the great persecutions of the church under Elizabeth I, but he kept his head because he wrote some pieces for Queen Elizabeth, which she liked so much that she spared him from the guillotine. As we move into these next couple of centuries, late Renaissance into the classical era, into the Romantic era of music, we see a great shift in masses, more instrumentation, and we really start to see sort of was secular music, which is chamber music, and so we get examples like Mozart, who 1756 to 1791 wrote, you may have heard this one, his Great Mass in C. That's a Kyrie, and it goes on for 6 whole minutes. The music of this era, these types of masses, really were becoming unwieldy. And for many composers, they really start to be more of showcase pieces rather than we start to see again a blurring of the lines between the secular and the sacred. So you could perform Mozart's Great Mass in C in a concert hall, but then you could also do it during a very, very solemn Mass as well. I don't know if it was ever used for a Mass. I don't think it's finished, actually. I think he died before it was finished. But some of his other Masses are just as grand and really start to take away, in my opinion, from the liturgy itself. It becomes a concert. We see other examples that are a little less over the top, in my opinion, like this one from Schubert, also a Kyrie. think that one could be much more easily used in a Mass setting. As we move into the end of the 19th century, the end of the 1800s, we see a push to kind of scale back some of these, big classical masses and to return to something that's infinitely more practical. And so we get examples from composers around the turn of the century. This is a requiem this is Fauré. And Duruflé is another composer at this era. Now these masses, the Fauré Requiem and the Duruflé Requiem, were both intended for liturgical use. They're scaled back, they're not as long as some of these 2-hour long pieces that you might run into during the Romantic period. Now, why do I spend this time talking about all of these big masses that most parishioners, most people in their parishes would have never heard something like that done, certainly not in the United States in its early years, except in maybe great cathedrals in Europe. So why bother? Well, we have to understand where we've come from in order to know where we're going. If we don't look at the whole progression of sacred music from its inception to the present, we're only going to run into the same problems, repeat some of the same mistakes that have occurred at different periods in the life of the church. Some of those mistakes, questionable theology in the use of hymns, a over-the-top sense of music in your ordinary parts, like we saw in the later Romantic period. So we don't want to fall into some of these bigger, pitfalls. There are also, don't want to skip out. We also have, as the different styles of music continue to develop, we move into the 19th to the 20th century, and we get into the folk masses of the 60s. Some of you may remember them. Something like this.
Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to stand on the will. We praise you, we bless you, we worship you, we glorify you.
Yeah, that was the Misa Bossa Nova from 1960. What does it say? 1960. Waiting for it to scroll. 1966. We can see certainly an influence of the secular in our sacred music in an example like that, and I think it's no less egregious than the over-the-top masses of the late 1800s. I would put them all in the same category, not stylistically, of course, but I think they suffer from the same problem. And then this piece, this is a Kyrie. This is a modern composition within the last 10 years, and this was used in It was used in London at Westminster Cathedral when Pope Benedict visited England. It's written by James Macmillan. Very modern, a little bit different, but was actually used in liturgy. And this is a Kyrie. So that's obviously a much more modern piece. And in the vernacular, it was in English. So how do we avoid the pitfalls of the past, and how do we move forward? Well, and what do we do in the meantime? I'd like to go over some basic principles for the liturgy and in sacred music in particular. And when I'm talking about these, I'm talking particularly, about the Mass. Active participation. Sing or else. This is the phrase active participation, I think, is something we've probably all heard before. And I know there have been some talks on Vatican II in the past here at the cathedral. And so I'm sure you all know, what does active participation mean? But I think it's sometimes used sort of to bludgeon people into singing, sing or else. Now, Sacrosanctum Concilium number 14 says, in the restoration and promotion of the sacred liturgy, this full active participation by all the people is the aim to be considered before all else, for it is the primary and indispensable source from which the faithful are to derive the true Christian spirit. We are to actively participate in the liturgy. It says that right there in Sacrosanctum Concilium. Now, does that mean sing or else? Active participation. When we look at other papal documents that talk about active participation in the liturgy, we can turn to Mediator Dei number 93. This was Pope Pius XII's document on reform of the liturgy. And he wrote, it is based on the fact that the people unite their hearts in praise, impetration, expiation, and thanksgiving with prayers or intention of the priest, even of the high priest himself, so that in the one and same offering of the victim and according to a visible sacerdotal rite, they may be presented to God the Father. This is the true nature of participation. This is the true nature of participation. It's a uniting of hearts in praise, impetration, expiation, and thanksgiving with the prayers and intention of the priest or of the other sacred ministers in the liturgy. Active participation, therefore, doesn't mean everybody has to be doing something physical. It can mean that. It can mean that, and there is a certain physical aspect to our participation. We're human beings. We're made of matter. We have to do things as well. We can't just be in an incorporeal sense. But you may say, okay, this is Pius XII. This is before the council. Well, this is a document, Musica Sacra, which came out after Sacrosanctum Concilium, the conciliar document, which is an explanation regarding sacred music and what Sacrosanctum Concilium means. And so this is what Musica Sacra says about active participation. The faithful fulfill their liturgical role by making that full, conscious, and active participation, we see active participation again, which is demanded by the nature of the liturgy itself, and which is, by reason of baptism, the right and duty of the Christian people. This participation, first of all, it should be above all internal, in the sense that by it the faithful join their mind to what they pronounce or hear and cooperate with heavenly grace. Secondly, this B must be, on the other hand, external also, so that is such as shows the internal participation by gestures, i.e. making the sign of the cross, bodily attitudes, sitting, standing, kneeling, the acclamations, responses, and singing. The faithful should also be taught to unite themselves interiorly to what the ministers or choir sing, so that by listening to them, they may raise their minds to God. It is the duty of all Catholics in the pews to sing sometimes. That doesn't mean we have to sing absolutely everything. Again, we don't have to do everything in order to actively participate in the liturgy. Each person has a different station, each person has different abilities, and so no one should be expected to do something that they, in some cases, just physically can't do. I know some people that are just tone deaf, that cannot sing. The church doesn't expect them to. It should also be noted that, that not everyone is in the same place in their life as everybody else in there. As we come to Mass, it's a group of very diverse people. Some people going through all sorts of problems, some people going through great joyous times in their life. And so that may mean that at some points we come to Mass, we don't really feel like singing or holding hands or doing hand motions or clapping or whatever it may be. And the church doesn't impose that upon us. The church doesn't impose that upon us. You do not have to clap or sing or else. So those are some general principles on active participation, what the church expects of the individual to do at Mass. So what should we be singing? Again, here's some general principles. Don't sing at Mass, but sing the Mass. I believe, was it last year, Sister, that you gave a presentation for the catechists? Yes, and I think this was one of your points. To sing the Mass. Don't sing at Mass. And what I mean by this is that text is primary with the singing of the liturgy. The text must come first. The text, the prayers that we use, the antiphons are the most important thing. Style is another story. That's another debate that we can get into. But primarily, the proper texts should be used. With that being said, what we should look to is not our missalettes. We all have the missalettes in our hands that are in the pews. Those should not be our go-to for what we should be singing. What we should be looking at, rather, at least the music directors, the choir leaders, should be the missal itself. Those are the texts of the Mass. Just a quick illustration of some of the problems that can arise if we rely solely on these little suckers. These are the bane of my existence. I hate these. During Easter, on Easter Sunday, there is a very ancient poem that is set to music called a sequence. They crop up a couple of times a year. Easter, Pentecost, Corpus Christi, and Our Lady of Sorrows, actually in September, is another one where we can use a sequence. So the Easter sequence, a very ancient hymn poem that's been used in the liturgy forever and ever and ever. And it says in here, the sequence, Victime Paschali Laudes, is sung before the Gospel acclamation on Easter Sunday. For musical settings, see Christ the Lord is risen today, number 397. These are not the words of the Victime Paschali Laudes. They're similar. They're close, sort of. The melody is certainly not the same. The theme is similar, but this is not a sequence. This is a hymn. We cannot replace a liturgical text in this instance with some other appropriate hymn. For hundreds of years, they've been singing something entirely else. They've been singing this. Victime Paschali laudes, simulent Christiani, agnus redemitovs Christus innocens patri, reconciliavit peccatores. That's the sequence. If you don't sing that, you should just recite the sequence. These are not what we should go to for our instructions on what to sing during the Mass. These booklets can be helpful, but we have to remember they're put out by a publishing company. In this case, this one is OCP. There are others, and they are all the same. They're in business to make money. They're in business to make money. Their aim is not necessarily proper liturgical practices and or liturgical tradition. Their modus operandi is selling their own musical compositions to parishes. So they don't necessarily have the same aim as the musicians and the people in the parish. They can be very helpful. They're very helpful in some aspects, but not as our source for what to sing in Mass. So what should we be singing? Now, I spoke a little bit earlier about the propers and the ordinary. When I say the word propers, these are the Mass texts that change every week. There are, if you go to the daily Mass here at the cathedral, you'll notice you say an entrance antiphon. It's just recited at the daily Masses. Well, there's also an entrance antiphon for Sunday Mass. And it changes from week to week. It usually has to do with the gospel that's being read. There's also an offertory, a text that should be used, that's proper to each Sunday, that's used before the offertory is brought up. And again at the communion, another particular text that should be said, and in most cases it is, at least at the cathedral, that should be said at communion time. So those are the propers, and they change every week. Some of them, in the Gregorian chant, they can be very complex. They can be very difficult to sing in some cases. The other part of the Mass is the ordinary. Those are the things that don't change week to week. We're familiar with that. We've learned, we all know different Mass settings, what we call Mass settings. So versions, the tunes that we use, the Gloria, the Holy, 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 the Agnus Dei, even the Alleluia. These are things that don't change every week. And so they're called the ordinary parts of the Mass. So what should we be singing as Catholics? Well, the ordinary parts, those don't change. We can learn those over time. The propers, because they change regularly, they change every week, there's a little bit of wiggle room there. They can be handed over to the choir, most certainly. But there are also simpler versions, simpler melodies that are being created even as we speak, to try to incorporate some of these chants back into the Mass. So what did Vatican II envision? When we really look at the texts, we'll see that Vatican II really envisioned chanting. It really envisioned chanting as sort of your go-to for Mass. Sacrosanctum Concilium, number 116, says that the Church acknowledges Gregorian chant as specifically suited to the Roman liturgy. Therefore, other things being equal, it should be given pride of place in liturgical services. Pride of place in liturgical services. Most of the times it's given no place in most liturgical services, which is unfortunate. That's what the Vatican document itself says. The Gregorian chant should be given pride of place. There are other places where it does give permission for other things to be used. We'll talk about that a little bit. But this pride of place means that the norm should be chant. They specifically mention Gregorian chant. We'll talk about some English chant here in a minute. In 1974, so that's what came out of the council. Well, several years after the council, at the end of the council, we have the new Mass that was created in 1970, the missal that we're all familiar with. Well, in 1974, a letter and a booklet was sent out by the Congregation for Divine Worship. And the letter states that this booklet was a personal gift from Pope Paul VI to all of the bishops. This copy was sent to all of the bishops and all the heads of the religious, saying, here's a gift, this is what we would like as the minimum requirement for Gregorian chant in your parishes. And so they sent this handy little missal, or this little booklet. It's called Jubilate Deo. Issued 1974, free to use and copy for free, free free, which should get most musicians, excited that you don't have to pay for it. But this is what was intended to be the minimum. This is what the parishes should be familiar with. And so we see some familiar things in this. Kyrie eleison. You can sing that one. You've heard that one before. Adorate devote latens deitas, que sub his figuris vere latitas. We've probably heard that one before. Tantum ergo sacramentum veneremo cenui, etc. Also in there. There may be some other ones in here that you may not have heard before, but simple things. Tu es Petrus et super hanc Petram, edificabo ecclesiam meam. That one was, you are Peter. It should be used on the feast of St. Peter, St. Peter and Paul. Other things that we're more familiar with. Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae, etc. These are things that we should know, and hopefully you have some familiarity with these already. But there are some simple Mass settings in here as well that were expected, that should be the minimum requirement. And there was a free gift from the Holy Father to all the bishops. Now, what do we have in most places? A four-hymn sandwich. We have an entrance hymn, and an offertory hymn, and a communion hymn, and a recessional hymn. Now, Musica Sacra does say the custom legitimately in use in certain places and widely confirmed by indults of substituting other songs for the songs given in the gradual for the entrance, offertory, and communion can be retained according to judgment of the competent local authorities. It is desirable that the assembly, however, this is a but, it is desirable that the assembly of the faithful should participate in the songs of the proper as much as possible, especially through simple responses and other suitable settings. We can use hymns. We can use hymns. They need to take into account the nature of the liturgy, the theme of the liturgy, the particular season that's going on within the church, and they are allowed. But as we can see, it's confirmed by indult, which means a special permission, not the ordinary thing. A special permission for something that was out of the ordinary had to be granted to allow the use of hymns. Now, hymns are a legitimate practice. Hymns are a legitimate practice, but I think they should be used a little more sparingly. But why? So you may ask, well, where did we get the four-hymn sandwich? Where were the problems? Where was the disconnect between what the document said and what happened? Well, look at the translation of this document in general. The custom legitimately in use of substituting other songs for the songs given in the gradual. They translate everything as songs. They translate every type of music in a lot of these documents, they just say songs. If it read substituting, don't die on me, substituting other songs for the chants given in the gradual, it may be, okay, well, we can read that as saying, well, the chants should be what we should be doing, but, in a bind we can go to the hymns. For various reasons, we can go to the hymns. So there is some confusion. Part of that is due to translation, like so many things. So who should sing what? Acclamations, responses to the greetings of the priests, these are kind of no-brainers. These are things, I'm getting these are the things that everybody should be singing. The acclamations, responses to the greeting. So, the Lord be with you and with your spirit. We can all sing that. Even if you can't carry a tune in a bucket, you can get through that much. Some of the other acclamations, the great Amen, the Gloria, the Sanctus, the Agnus Dei, these parts of the ordinary, these are the acclamations that they're talking about. A simple response to a responsorial psalm. Again, something that we can all sing. We should also be participating in litanies that we sing. At ordinations we sing great litanies. There are other kind of processional litanies you may use during processions, Corpus Christi or Eucharistic processions and whatnot. These are things that we can all participate in. They're simple responses that we can all do, and they're very repetitive. Antiphons, so antiphons and responses, repeated responses, and some hymns. These are things that we can all do. So what does all of this sound like? So in a perfect world where everything, is exactly by the books, what would Mass sound like? I want to run through some clips of some things that are out there available right now that could be used, that I think should be used for Mass. Everything is in English. Not everything is in English. I'll point out the things that are not. Everything is a simplified version of the Gregorian. And it's also written, these were all written within the last 10 years. So this is for if we could imagine the Feast of Corpus Christi. So this is what the introit, the entrance chant, if we were chanting it, would sound like.
With the finest of wheat, hallelujah, and with honey from the rock, he satisfied them. Hallelujah, hallelujah.
I think that's something, if we had the text in front of us, a little bit of some musical notations, we could follow that. We could all join in that. All of this is a cappella. If we had an organ accompanying us, I think we could all do it. Here's a Kyrie, a Lord have mercy.
Lord have mercy. Lord have mercy. Christ have mercy. Christ have mercy. Lord have mercy. Lord have
That one sounded a little bit more complex. It was in 4 parts. Obviously, those 4 parts would have been performed by the choir, but there was a simple melody that I hope you could hear of the Lord have mercy. This is also something you would be probably familiar with because you would be singing it every week as part of the ordinary. This is the new translation of the Gloria from the Missal itself. So a simple version of the Gloria.
Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to people of good will. We praise you, we bless you, we adore you, we glorify you, we give you thanks for your great glory, Lord God, heavenly King.
The melody of this is pretty repetitive. You know, it's the same kind of it's the same tone over and over, just this rising and falling tone. Something that I think even some of the worst musicians could learn to chant. That also had some organ accompaniment with it. Here's just a setting of the Psalms for Corpus Christi, the particular setting that I like. So this would be the responsorial psalm. Pretty familiar, just a different type of setting than what you're used to. Here's a Holy, Holy, Holy from the same Mass setting. So you should be able to hear some similarities in the theme, the musical theme.
Holy, 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 Lord God of hosts. Heaven and earth are full of your glory. Hosanna in the highest.
Here's the Lamb of God from this same Mass setting. you get to the communion, I think there's a little bit more flexibility. So here is a simple English proper of the communion. Again, in that chant style, a modified version of the Gregorian chant in English.
Flesh and drinks my blood, abides in me, and I in him, says the Lord. Blessed are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. Blessed are those who keep his decrees, with all their hearts they seek him. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood.
So for this communion, it's intended to be done like we would do the responsorial psalm. Cantor would sing it initially, and then we would pick it up. Then verses would be sung by a cantor or the choir, and then we would sing the refrain, kind of back and forth, back and forth. That can be extended throughout all of the communion. Or you can stop early, and your choir, which has been working very diligently, can sing this. And that's Byrd's Ave Verum Corpus, a very appropriate communion meditation, kind of post-communion song for the Feast of Corpus Christi. And then finally, because it is the Feast of Corpus Christi, we would have a procession and a Eucharistic procession on Corpus Christi. We would have to sing this. And I think certainly that the tune we're familiar with. The reason I do this, the reason I walked through all of that, is just to give you an idea of what I mean when I talk about the texts being primary. We can argue about the style all we want, till we're all blue in the face. I chose these because they are based on the Gregorian chant. It gives kind of a nod to the Gregorian chant, to the history, while still being simpler and in the vernacular. Any parish could certainly use any psalm tone that they wanted for the chant. There are some typical psalm tones that we would all know that we could sort of kind of make up as you go along, but using the proper texts. That's the key. That's the thing I think we should all be striving for in doing liturgy better, doing liturgy according to the mind of the church, is getting back to the texts. Again, we can talk about style, and a lot of that depends on the talent that you have in your parish. But certainly, chanting of the propers can be done fairly easily. In St. Michael's, I've asked the choir they sing an opening hymn, and then as I approach the altar, as soon as they finish their verse of the hymn, or second verse of the hymn, they sing the entrance antiphon. So they're incorporating the chant, or at least the proper texts, into, and they just use a simple chant tone. da 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 da. They just set whatever the text is to something like that. So it certainly can be done. It certainly can be done. Now, is reform of the liturgy, is making liturgy beautiful something that is easy? No. Ask any of the musicians in the choir, it's not something easy. It takes training. It calls on all of our efforts, in prayer, all of our efforts, physically and with our own talents. But this is no different than the faith itself. The faith is not easy. It's not something that we can just, pick up whenever and expect to, just jump right into it. It takes practice. It takes effort on our part. It's simple in some ways, but yet infinitely complex in its meaning and just in its depth of meaning. So yes, it is difficult. It is difficult. Doing things the way that I demonstrated them today would take some preparation. But most things worth doing, take some effort. And surely beautiful liturgy is something that should take some effort. That should be no exception. Just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I'll open it up for questions. I know we're getting on toward 8 o'clock. I'll open up for questions. I've listed here some of the sources that I've used. If you don't believe me, you can go read it for yourself. Mostly some church documents, a lot of Gregorian chant history. Sing Like a Catholic, Why Catholics Can't Sing, or a little more popular works. They don't obviously carry the same weight as the magisterial documents, and they're really kind of the opinions of these particular writers, but I think they're very helpful. Spirit of the Liturgy by Joseph Ratzinger, which one of you lucky people will be taking home with you. Obviously, again, the Roman Missal should be something that we turn to, that we use. The general instruction of the Roman Missal, where you're not sure about what it means in the Roman Missal, you turn to the instruction booklet, and there it is. The Graduale. The Graduale really should be in every church musician's library. It's all of the propers, all of the Gregorian chant propers, what should be sung at every Mass throughout the year. And I've got a copy here if anybody wants to take a look at that. I also have to acknowledge that most of the recordings of the English chants came from the simple English propers, and they're produced by Corpus Christi Watershed, a publishing company. They do have a lot of their material that's online for free, so it's always a good recommendation to go to them, look through what they've got. There are other composers that are writing English versions of the proper Gregorian melodies. Father Samuel Weber is a Benedictine monk at Meinrad Seminary, and he is going through basically just changing all of the Latin text to English and fitting it with the traditional melodies. It's a great. Those were some of the chants that we used in the seminary for our liturgies, and they're very, very beautiful. Question.
Veni Sancte Spiritus, et emite celitus, lucis Tuae radium. Veni Pater Pater,